Are You Being Served will not be seen this evening so that we may bring you continued coverage of the Pennsylvania senatorial debates. Watch for Are You Being Served when it returns tomorrow evening.
Tonight's Republican senatorial debate is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Association of Broadcasters in conjunction with the Pennsylvania State Education Association. 100,000 members working in your local public schools. Quality education. Our commitment, our challenge.
Hello, I'm Terry Ruggles. Welcome to Altoona. Tonight, the site of the debate between Arlen Specter and Steve Friend, the two men vying for the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate. Now, let me explain the ground rules for this evening's debate. The questions will come from a panel of journalists. Each candidate will answer the same question. Answers to the first rounds of questions will be 90 seconds in length. The second round of questions, 60-second answers. The candidate who is answering second on one question will answer first on the next question. Asking our questions this evening, our panelist, Greg Demchek. He's representing WTAJ-TV here in Altoona. Marty Radovanovic, representing WJAC-TV in Johnstown. Danya Archer, representing WWCP-TV, representing Johnstown, and WATM-TV from Altoona. And William Kelly from WVIA-TV, Scranton-Wilkes-Barre. Now, before tonight's broadcast, it was agreed that Mr. Friend would get the first question. That first question is coming from Craig Domchek. Craig?
Thank you, Terry. Let's start with the biggest concern for many Americans. Mr. Friend, please give us a blueprint of sorts for rebuilding or at the very least revitalizing the economy, and please include your proposals for tax reform.
Well, Craig, we have to do exactly the opposite of what we've been doing. Arlen Specter in 1990 voted for the second largest tax increase in the history of the nation, $200 billion. Absolutely fueled the recession, put hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians out of work. What we need is an across-the-board tax cut, which will generate more rather than less revenue, as it did under Ronald Reagan, as it did under John F. Kennedy. We need tax credits for job retraining, for the production of American goods, for the creation of new jobs. And we need a level playing field with foreign competition. And there, Arlen Specter's been the problem, not the solution. Arlen Specter, believe it or not, was the deciding vote to give, not to sell, but to give away our vital aircraft technology to Japan, imperiling hundreds of thousands of American jobs. He's never seen a foreign aid bill he didn't like. He supports the $10 billion loan guarantee to Israel, which we can't support, and yet torpedoed a $29 billion sale of F-15s to Saudi Arabia in 1986, which would have created or kept 100,000 jobs. And now he wants to do it again. Now he's in opposition to the $8 billion sale of F-15s to Saudi Arabia, which create 40,000 new jobs. Arlen Specter has to understand he's a United States senator representing us, not a senator from Japan and not a senator from Israel. He has to understand that charity begins at home. Unfortunately, Arlen Specter has forgotten where home is. I won't.
Thank you, Mr. Specter. The question is a blueprint to revitalize the economy and a blueprint for tax reform.
I thought that was the question, but notice how much time my opponent spent on Arlen Specter instead of the question. I would start with reform to get the deficit under control. And I would move from there to tax reform with the investment tax credit, with the capital gains credit, and most fundamentally with the legislation which Senator Domenici and I have advocated to use the IRAs to stimulate consumer purchasing power. The issue of economic recovery is very fundamental. And from my position on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, I have worked hard and successfully to a large extent in retaining important defense jobs. For example, at Letterkenny, at Tobyhanna, at New Cumberland. There was an effort to take the Corps of Engineers away from Pittsburgh, which was important not only for jobs, but also because of the maintenance of the inland waterway system. Also, the battle with the Philadelphia Navy Yard, initiated by John Hines and myself, carried on by Senator Wofford. When there is talk about who has cut taxes and who has raised taxes, my opponent is exactly wrong. The legislation I voted for in 1981 and 1986 has led to enormous tax cuts, and the Citizens Group for Tax Awareness has given me the Bulldog Award of the Year for 3 Congresses for holding down taxes.
Thank you, Senator. Marty Radovanek has the second question, and Mr. Specter, you get the second question. Marty?
Mr. Specter, given the current groundswell of voter anger sweeping across America against the political establishment, how concerned are you tonight about your own electability, and what guarantees are you prepared to give the citizens of Pennsylvania that you really mean what you say and it's not more of the same?
Mr. Radovanek, I would start with my record of paying very close attention to the local problems and staying in touch with the pulse of the people of the state. I have visited every one of Pennsylvania's 67 counties on many, many occasions. And I understand the concern that people have when incumbents stay in Washington and get out of touch with the people of the state. I live in Pennsylvania. I spend 4 days a week in Pennsylvania, and frequently on the other 3, I travel through Pennsylvania. But it is my travels to Erie which acquainted me with the fact that you have to have Presque Isle and the breakwaters to provide jobs and stimulate tourism. It's my trip to Reading which showed me the Warren Street Highway, which needed finishing, which we did with the new highway bill. It's the Exton Bypass in Chester County, which I found by going there. It's the problems of the farmers on the northern tier in traveling through Wayne, Bradford, Susquehanna counties. It's the details of the inland waterway system, which I see when I visit Pittsburgh. I have visited every county in this state repeatedly to stay in touch with the people of Pennsylvania, to understand the first priority is providing more jobs, the priority for affordable health insurance for all Americans, crime control, environmental reform, a level playing field on international trade.
Thank you, Mr. Specter. Mr. Friend, the question had a backdrop of voter anger against the incumbents. What would you do to guarantee that you carry out what you say you will do?
Arlen Specter is a classic example of an individual who, once elected, joins the club in the Potomac that doesn't realize there's a world outside of the Beltway. Sure, he comes back to Pennsylvania for his photo ops, and once back in Washington, he forgets those people. Do you think that they wanted him to vote for the massive tax increase? Talk about deficits? Do you think they wanted Arlen Specter to vote for every deficit budget, which now gives us a $3.5 trillion debt? And when the average wager last year paid his income tax or her income tax, 40% was for debt service, for interest on what we owe. He talks about the environment. Arlen Specter is part of a conspiracy to turn rural Pennsylvania into one gigantic toxic waste pay toilet. In conspiracy with those with fat checkbooks and political connections, Arlen Specter has washed his hands and walked the other way when they are attempting, big political contributors in Union County, in Jefferson County, in Clarion County, to force down the throat of those people toxic waste dumps which will devastate that environment for themselves, for their children, and for their grandchildren. Take a look, Arlen. The world does extend beyond the Beltway.
Thank you, Mr. Friend. Danya Archer has our next question. Ms. Archer?
Yes, thank you. Both of you have been criticized by women's groups. Mr. Specter for your treatment of Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas hearings. Mr. Friend for your very controversial abortion bill. What assurance can you give the women voters of Pennsylvania that their rights will be protected and you'll meet their needs?
The difference between Arlen Specter and Steve Friend is with Steve Friend, what you see is what you get. Everyone knows where I stand on the issue of the sanctity of all human life. Yes, I'm the legislative leader of the pro-life movement in Pennsylvania, one of the national spokesmen for the cause of life, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud of being the author of the Abortion Control Act that's now before the United States Supreme Court. My worst enemies will admit that I do what I do out of conviction, and yet I respect other people's opinions. I know it's a divisive issue, and I know that those who believe in abortion rights feel betrayed by Arlen Specter. They had every reason to believe that Arlen Specter would torpedo a conservative pro-life nominee in Clarence Thomas, whom I very much supported, the same way he torpedoed another extremely conservative pro-life nominee, Robert Bork. What they didn't understand was Arlen Specter's election calendar. Doing anything, saying anything to get reelected so he could stay in the club. You see, Clarence Thomas came on the eve of what Arlen Specter knows will be an extremely tough Republican primary. Robert Bork came right after Arlen Specter's reelection. And what I find interesting tonight is this setup with respect to the debate is Arlen Specter's setup. He insisted only be a half an hour. He insisted to be 4 panelists. All deference to the panel to protect him. You see, Arlen Specter knows that the difference here is my name is Steve Friend, not Anita Hill.
Mr. Specter, let me remind you of the question. The question was, what would you do to protect women voters' rights? That was the question.
My record on women's rights is one of the strongest among the 535 members of Congress. I understand that the questioning of Professor Hill concerned people, and we were on a very raw nerve in dealing with the sensitive issue of sexual harassment. And by hindsight, we should have called Professor Hill in privately, we should have called Justice Thomas in privately, and later made the disclosures. But aside from that issue, I have been for choice. I have been very supportive on the Health and Human Services Subcommittee of funding for women's medical issues on breast cancer, on ovarian cancer. I led the fight on the Senate floor against the gag rule, and my ratings on women's issues has consistently been the highest of those in the United States Senate. Now contrast that with what my opponent has done in trying to promote his anti-choice bill. He made the representation that women cannot get pregnant when they are the victims of rape, a ridiculous statement which he stood by in an effort to try to bolster his own effort on the anti-choice bill. This evening when I came in on this subject with his supporters, I was jostled, I was pushed and assaulted. And I think my opponent has an answer to make to that one on this issue, which he has riled up so much emotion, which doesn't belong in politics at all.
Thank you, Senator. William Kelly from the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre market has the next question. Bill, it's to Mr. Specter.
Mr. Specter, Americans are apparently turned off by the bad checks, the influence of political action committees, the big money it takes to run for office these days. You and your opponent will raise several $1 million to pay for the costs of your run for the Senate. Would you describe for the audience the kind of campaign you would run if you could rewrite all of the rules and traditions of American political campaigning?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. When you start with the issue of the checks and the perks, long before the check scandal came up, I introduced legislation in the Senate that every single Senate perk ought to be evaluated by the Rules Committee, and if there was something given on the outside, like parking, so be it, give it on the inside. But that we should pay fair market value for everything which we receive. With respect to how I'd like to campaign, I would like to see limits on campaign spending, but not if it is going to be at the taxpayer's expense. Senator Hollings and I have supported legislation which would reverse Buckley versus Vallejo so that there could be spending limits. While I do not believe that political action committees' contributions are corrupting, I have taken a public stand that I think that political action committees ought to be eliminated. But notwithstanding the issue of funding, I have sought to make myself available to Pennsylvanians by visiting every single county and having open house town meetings. You do not have to come to a fundraising event to have access to my attention. And I have respond to some 2,000 letters a day, respond to visitors who come to my office. I think I have been in touch with the people of Pennsylvania, but if we had campaign finance reform, it would be even better.
Thank you, Mr. Specter. Mr. Friend, the question was, describe the campaign you would run if you could rewrite the campaign laws.
Well, the question also involved perks. Here we have Arlen Specter voting for a third gymnasium. I know Mr. Specter plays squash, but can he play it in a public gym? For special tax deductions for congressmen, unlimited outside income, third highest franking privilege in the United States Senate, $1 million last year, 6.5 million pieces of mail, many of which went to his contributors. Last week, Arlen Specter was caught with his hand in the till about to break federal election laws. To join Arlen Specter's, quote, club, unquote, you have to give $1,000. And in return, you can come to Washington and on taxpayer property attend a political affair. What did Mr. Specter say when he was caught? First, he said he was innocent, and then he tried to blame it on the late John Hines, saying he learned that from John Hines, a man who unfortunately is no longer with us and can't defend himself. This is absolutely ridiculous. Arlen Specter is the darling of the special interest. You're about to see $3 million worth of slick media. And every time you see one of those television ads or radio ads making Mr. Specter appear to be the second coming, ask yourself this question. What special interest bought this ad? What did Mr. Specter have to give away to have this ad run? Was it to a lobby for a foreign nation? Was it for one of those toxic waste magnates that are trying to pollute Pennsylvania? Was it for the teachers' unions? What special interest? And that's the difference between Steve Friend and Arlen Specter. Arlen Specter takes money from the special interest. Steve Friend has made a career of fighting them.
Thank you, Mr. Friend. Gentlemen, as a reminder, this next set of questions, the answer is a minute in length. The first question coming from Craig Demchak.
Mr. Friend, both of you have traded accusations on the campaign trail. Do you feel this is really what voters want to hear right now from their candidates?
I think it's completely legitimate to contrast the differences between Steve Friend and Arlen Specter. That's what this campaign is all about, and never has there been greater differences. The greatest issue is credibility. Which one can you trust? Arlen Specter tells gun owners that he supports the right to bear arms, as I do, and then takes a walk on the single most important gun vote of his career. He promises the VFW he'll protect the American flag, and then he turns around and votes against the flag-burning amendment. He promises parents that he supports tuition tax credits and deductions, and then jumps into bed with the teachers' unions, takes a fat contribution, and goes the other way. One broken promise after another. He promises Pennsylvanians that he cares about the environment, and then in return for political contributions, walks the other way when rural Pennsylvania in those counties is about to be polluted. That's the single most important issue. You can't expect to agree with your elected officials on every issue, but you have a right to demand to know where they stand in clear, unmistakable language. Unlike Arlen Specter, with me, like me or not, agree with me or not, what you see is what you get, and I always do what I do out of conviction, not expediency.
Thank you, Mr. Friend. Mr. Specter, the question was, the candidates seem to be trading accusations. Is this what you think the voters want to hear?
I think the voters do not want to hear that. And if you listen to the responses this evening, virtually all of my time has been spent on the substantive issue. And more than 2/3 of my opponent's time has been spent on an attack on Arlen Specter. I think that the voters of Pennsylvania want to know what I'm prepared to do about putting Pennsylvanians and Americans to work. And I have specific programs. They want to know what I can do to bring affordable health care to Pennsylvanians. The monies that I have put up in addition on research for cancer and for Alzheimer's disease and for lead poisoning. What I have done to stop unfair foreign trade practices on the VRAs to see to it that specialty steel has a level playing field. What I have done on the drug issues. I could go through a long list of how my opponent has violated the ethics code, how he has raised his pay rate and denied he has done so when people are unemployed, and many of his problems.
Senator.
But I stick to the positive.
Thank you, Senator. You do get the first question now, and it comes from Marty Rodanovic. Marty?
Mr. Specter, millions of Americans are looking for real leadership in the area of long-term health care and the cost of health insurance. What specifically would you do to solve the health care cost crisis? And, sir, please be very specific on what it would cost the people of Pennsylvania.
The specific proposals that I have been set forth in legislation, Senate Bill 1936, proposed by the task force headed by Senator Chafee, and my own bill on preventive medicine. But I have a record on the Health and Human Services Subcommittee where I have taken the lead in increasing research funding for cancer, for heart disease, for rural health, for mental health. I have legislation which embodies proposals for managed care to cut costs by at least 20%, which would extend coverage to the 37 million Americans not now covered. Proposals for reduction of costs at the terminal stage of illness, for 1-pound babies who were born to teenagers with a human tragedy and enormous costs. And with my legislative proposals, we could cover the 37 million Americans now not covered and also reduce costs considerably for affordable health care for all Americans.
Thank you, Mr. Specter. Mr. Friend, what would you do to cut health care costs, and what would the people of Pennsylvania have to pay?
Well, I think we all know that Harris Wofford got away with murder in the last election. Pie in the sky national health insurance that would bankrupt us and would take us to socialized medicine. Nonetheless, we have to do something about our health care problem. I have a 5-point program, and very quickly, number one, heavy reliance on tax deductions. 100% dollar for dollar for individuals, 125% for business to encourage them to have health care plans for their employees. Savings accounts, health care savings accounts, tax-free to permit employees to roll the money over from year to year when they don't use it, encouraging them to save and not waste. Going to war with the trial lawyers, and I'm the only person in the history of Pennsylvania to defeat the trial lawyers on auto insurance reform, for tort reform to reduce medical malpractice, cleaning up Medicaid, and permitting those who fall between the cracks, who don't make enough to get health insurance but make too much to qualify for Medicaid, to buy in, based on their income, into the Medicaid program. But most importantly, to fight the special interest, to take on the trial lawyers to whom Arlen Specter takes money, for tort reform to reduce the medical malpractice which is strangling us.
Thank you, Mr. Friend. Donya Archer has a question. It goes to Mr. Friend.
Along the lines of health care, I think everyone has been shocked by the Uncle Eddie AIDS case in Philadelphia. Where do you stand on funding for AIDS prevention and research?
Well, I think AIDS is extremely important. The issue is extremely important, and I certainly support the funding for AIDS research. I think, however, that I wouldn't have supported the amendment that Arlen Specter voted. I would have supported the amendment that Arlen Specter voted against that permits states that have very few AIDS cases to use the money for cancer research and other things. What I wouldn't also do, as Arlen Specter does, is support placing sexual preference in the Civil Rights Act to give that choice of conduct, largely responsible for the spread of AIDS, the same protection that we give to race and creed and color and religion and sex and origin. I also would not support the amendment to fund in Washington, D.C., giving junkies needles, thereby causing and continuing the spread of AIDS. We have to stand up on this issue, and I also think we have to have mandatory testing for physicians dealing with AIDS patients, and with AIDS patients who might be suspected of having AIDS, the physicians have a right to test them. I think we have to get tough. I think we have to go to the war. But what you don't do is deify that choice of conduct, sexual preference, which has largely been responsible for a disease that can make the bubonic plague look like a walk in the park.
Thank you, Mr. Friend. Mr. Specter, where do you stand on AIDS funding and research?
I have taken the lead in supporting AIDS funding and AIDS research, and I wrote the laws for pediatric AIDS for the infants who were stricken with AIDS. I do not believe that it does any good to moralize on this subject, and the Civil Rights Bill is legislation which is designed at providing equality of opportunity, employment opportunity for all Americans, and has nothing whatever to do with this question, contrary to what my opponent has said. But we face an enormously serious problem with AIDS as an epidemic. And on my position on the Health and Human Services Subcommittee, I have taken a lead in securing funding along this line, trying to deal with the people who have the problem, trying to win their confidence, trying not to ostracize them because they pose a threat not only to themselves but to everyone, and to try to bring this dreaded epidemic under control.
Thank you, Mr. Specter. We're going to move now to some closing remarks by our candidates. Gentlemen, you both have 90 seconds for your closing remarks. Mr. Friend, you're first.
If you're happy with the way things are, with the tax and spend policy which is driving us into bankruptcy, with a foreign policy that forgets that America comes first and is costing us millions of American jobs, with an educational system that's shortchanging our students and our taxpayers, if you're content to roll over to a small minority who want to rip apart the moral fabric of this nation, if you're content electing people who go to Washington and join the club and forget that there's a world outside of the Beltway, with the perks and the check-kiting and the arrogance, if you're content with betrayals and double talk and lies, then I suggest that you support Arlen Specter. But if you want to change, if you want fiscal sanity, if you want someone who'll stand up in clear terms and fight against the special interest, I hope you'll consider me. Maybe it's old-fashioned, but I think there's still a place in life and in government for courage and conviction and honor, and yes, for accepting the fact that we owe what we owe to God, our dependence on God. I'll never apologize for accepting Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And I'll never apologize for saying that my first priority isn't to get reelected to join the club, but to spend eternity with God. It's a wonderful state with wonderful people. I know that I could make a difference in helping them to have a better life. I ask for your support. I thank you for your consideration. God bless all of us, and God bless Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Friend. Mr. Specter, your concluding remarks, please.
Thank you, Terry. I begin by thanking the Pennsylvania broadcasters and the ladies and gentlemen who are watching this program, and to say at the outset of this brief closing statement that I am optimistic about the future of America and the future of Pennsylvania. Both of my parents came to this country from foreign shores, but I have had a better opportunity than they did, and I believe that my children and my children's children can have even better opportunities, providing we identify the priorities which are important to Pennsylvanians and we fight to bring those priorities to fruition. In my travels through Pennsylvania's 67 counties, I have seen unemployment, and I have seen people worried about the lack of health insurance, and I have seen people concerned about where their next sustenance will come from. I have seen people very much concerned about the problems of unfair foreign imports, and in the Senate, I have acted to deal with those problems. On crime control, I authored the Armed Career Criminal Bill. When it comes to environmental protection, I have been at the forefront in trying to bring reasonable balance so that we can have jobs and environmental protection. This is an important election, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate the opportunity to be in your living rooms for a few moments. I thank the Pennsylvania broadcasters, and I ask for your support for my renomination on primary election day 4 weeks from tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, panel, and thank you for being with us to take a look at the two men who want to be the Republican U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania. Just remember, the primary election is just about a month away. Don't forget to vote. Good night.
You have just seen the Pennsylvania Republican senatorial debate. It was brought to you by the Pennsylvania Association of Broadcasters, whose member stations, owners, managers, and staffs urge you to vote in the upcoming Pennsylvania primary. Good evening.
Tonight's Republican senatorial debate has been brought to you by the Pennsylvania Association of Broadcasters in conjunction with the Pennsylvania State Education Association. 100,000 members working in your local public schools. Quality education. Our commitment, our challenge.